I said last time that wrapping up a few last points, things that we're just really reviewing from last year, talking about the reign of Pius XI. But the things we looked at last year, which we're focusing now, on which we are now focusing, considering Pacelli's role in all this, which we saw, but was since by the way. Also, in this case, the very last thing we mentioned was that in August of 1938, Pius XI summoned Giovanni Battista Montini back to Rome, having rehabilitated him in 1937 and made him one of Pacelli's under-secretaries in the Vatican Secretariat of State. He had been banished earlier because he was known to be anti-fascist. Anti-fascist because he was a communist. Remember, at this time, there's this big struggle going on, which would eventually overflow into war between the two forms of leftism. And these are indeed two forms of leftism, the national or the international model. The international one known as communism, the national one, its different brands, either known as fascism or Nazism, but all of it socialism, leftism. All of it anti-Catholic, ultimately. Even if Catholics got involved in the national version to some extent, or forged in some way some alliance with it, and because of the what was perceived as the greater threat, which was the international version. But Montini was anti-fascist. He was a communist, therefore he was known as being anti-fascist. Therefore Mussolini didn't like him. Therefore he was gotten rid of. But he was eventually rehabilitated. And Pius XI wanted Montini to write a letter to Mussolini concerning the Pope's position on the Jews and Catholic action. So Cardinal Pacelli, our focus here, dissuaded the Pope from sending the letter lest it anger Mussolini. Instead, Father Tacchi Venturi, remember the go-between, the backdoor channel, so to speak, would communicate the Pope's thoughts to the Duce in person. So he's going to let him know these things, so rather than send it in an official letter, something that could be a record that could be referred back to, he just wants to have him told in person. So the Jesuit, Father Tacchi Venturi, met with the Duce on August 8th, bringing with him a memo recording the Pope's thoughts. He read it aloud, and after discussing the Pope's views with the Duce, left the memo with him. So not an official thing like a letter, but a memo which will help him to remember what exactly it is that the positions of the Pope and indeed of the Church concerning these things. So Pius XI made it clear that he did not want to interfere in the state's responsibility for taking the opportune measures in defense of legitimate interests, but did not want Mussolini to go beyond what was demanded by Christian charity. So it's true that the harsh treatment of one or another group of people might not be a contrary to the requirements of charity. The state, if some group of people is causing trouble in a state, as the fact of the matter is that the Jews managed to cause trouble in different places, they managed to get themselves hated one way or another just about everywhere, it's not unreasonable that certain actions should be taken against not only the Jews, but anybody, any group of people who might be causing trouble. The state has to provide for the common good of the people over whom they rule. So it's not inconceivable that certain measures might have to be taken against the Jews in particular, but definitely Mussolini was going beyond the bounds of Christian charity, far beyond what the Church would ever do. It's true that St. Pius V actually required the Jews living in Rome to hear a sermon every year on the Catholic faith delivered by a Dominican. So it was with the idea, among other things, that we have to convert them, or do everything we can to hold the door open for their conversion. So even as when the popes were the rulers of the papal states, they took certain measures against the Jews, but there was always well within the what's permitted by charity, by the virtue of charity. Whereas Mussolini is definitely going beyond that. All the marriage laws that he's laying down, he's forbidding marriages between Jews, as he defines them, and Italians. Jews being just anybody born of Jewish parents, regardless of what religion he professes. So even talking about the case of a Jew who has converted, has abandoned the false religion, as it is, of Judaism, and has become a Catholic, Mussolini's laws still forbid that marriage. The laws of the church, in fact, forbid marriages between baptized and unbaptized persons. That's not to be confused with a mixed marriage. The laws of the church concerning marriage are quite complicated, actually. There are many different laws. That is easily the most miserable sacrament to have to study for a multitude of reasons. From just about every aspect, it's miserable to have to study. And one of the aspects, one of the things that we have to keep always in mind, principles that we have to apply constantly to cases that come to us, are all the impediments of the church that the church can lay down concerning marriage. So the general principle is that the church has anybody who has undergone a ceremony of baptism, which at least there's enough probability that that baptism was valid, the church can legislate concerning that person's baptism. So even if this is even concerning people who are baptized heretics and grew up outside of the church, were baptized into, we might say, a heretical sect, the church still has jurisdiction over those marriages. Talking about the marriages among unbaptized pagans in heathen nations, the church doesn't have anything to say about that. But even anybody who's baptized anybody who is legally considered baptized is subject to the laws of the church concerning marriage. So the church therefore permits that the marriages among baptized heretics who are born outside the church, raised outside the church as heretics, they marry amongst themselves, those marriages are valid. But a Catholic who abandons the church and becomes a heretic, he tries to marry another heretic before a Protestant minister, for example, that marriage is invalid by laws of the church. So there are many different impediments. The impediment of mixed marriage is between a baptized Catholic and a baptized heretic. Rather than go into all the technicalities of that, we'll just specify that at this moment to be distinct from the impediment of disparity of cult, as it's called, which is marriage between a baptized Catholic and an unbaptized person. That is invalid by the laws of the church. There's nothing in the natural law preventing such a marriage from occurring, but the church is so opposed to such marriages occurring that in principle those are invalid. The church could dispense from that impediment. So a Catholic could validly marry a Jew, but not without a dispensation from that impediment. And keep in mind there are also different kinds of impediments. Some impediments are merely prohibentis in Latin, so the prohibitory, perhaps we could say. They forbid the marriage from occurring and render it gravely illicit, but it's still valid. So in the case of a Catholic, rather than come up with cases for mixed marriage, we'll focus here on the question of disparity of cult. The church, on the other hand, can put down. Can make it so that a particular impediment is invalidating. So an attempted marriage, in a case where this impediment obtains, is invalid. So a case of a baptized Catholic attempting to marry an unbaptized person without the necessary dispensation is invalid. So, keeping all that in mind, that does not obtain, the church says that impediment of disparity of cult does not obtain, it does not apply to cases of Jews who have been baptized and received into the church and who then go to marry another Catholic. They are Catholics at that point. So the church has no problem with that marriage any more than marriage between any other two Catholics. As far as the church is concerned, those are Catholics. Whereas Mussolini was making a distinction. He was considering them still to be Jews as far as he was concerned. So, as we said, the same was true. Pius XI reminded Mussolini that Jewish converts to the Catholic faith under the rules of the Concordat were Catholics, and marriages that they attempted to then contract with other Catholics were valid. That's what all that should say right there. And that he must not in any way infringe upon this right to marry. So all this, yes, infringing upon rights to marry, there are some people who might not be well suited to entering the married state for one reason or another, and there's a variety of reasons why that might be the case, and such people ought to be discouraged, even by the priest, from entering the married state, but at the end of the day, it cannot be forbidden in a case in which that person indeed has the right to marry. If there are no impediments, either for that person to marry or for him to marry the person that he wants to marry, that cannot ultimately be forbidden. The laws of the church do not forbid it. It might still be gravely imprudent, even if valid. In fact, the authors even talk about that, the cases of mixed marriages of a Catholic, a baptized Catholic marrying a baptized heretic with everything in place as it ought to be, the promises being made to the children, and children born to the marriage will be raised Catholic, and so on and so forth. Even when the church dispenses from that prohibiting impediment, the authors explain, talking about that one in particular, that it could still be gravely imprudent. The church grants a dispensation for this marriage to take place does not mean that it's a good idea. Ultimately, mixed marriages are tolerated, even on that level. That's a toleration. In the mind of the church, Catholics marry Catholics, and that's it. Yeah. Other scenarios might be permitted in order to bring about some greater good or avoid a greater evil, but only for those reasons. And so, even in the case of a mixed marriage with everything in place as it ought to be, that might still be a very, very bad idea. There might still be grave sin committed in the contraction of that marriage, potentially, not necessarily, but potentially. So, anyone who has the right to marry ultimately cannot be forbidden from doing so, even if it might be a bad idea for him to do so. Ultimately, he has the right. He cannot be forbidden from exercising it. And this is true, of course, of the laws of the state. There are moral theologians who assert that it seems to be correct, that civil laws permitting civil divorce, that is a full divorce, as far as the state is concerned, a sundering of a valid marriage bond. Moral theologians say that such a law is intrinsically evil, which is a position which seems to be correct because the argument being that how could that possibly be permitted? How could that possibly be a true law on the part of the state when the law of God does not permit that? The law of God does not allow the dissolution of such a marriage bond. How could the laws of the state possibly allow it? So it's not a true law, certainly, because all authority comes from God, and legislation is one of the exercises of authority, the passing of laws. So God does not authorize that. It is not a true law. It is an attempt, an evil attempt at a law. So all that is very complicated. Marriage laws, dispensations, from different impediments, and so on and so forth. All of that is very complicated. We're not going to go into that too much right now, but again, a Jew who has been baptized suffers from no impediments as far as disparity of cult is concerned. Certainly not that, or if there's an impediment, it's on some other title from his getting married, for either himself or anybody else, either for himself for marrying anybody or for anyone for marrying him. There's some impediment, it's on some other title. He's a Catholic. The same is true also of Jews who, with a dispensation from the church, married a Catholic. So the church can allow that, can permit that, can dispense from that invalidating impediment. Obviously, there has to be some very strong reason why that should be done, but it could be done. Pius XI concluded by recalling that while the church and the popes, in the domains over which they ruled, took care to rein in the children of Israel and took protective measures against their evil doing, they never mistreated them. Definitely not. In that sense, there was never any persecution of them. Persecution, if we're talking about distinguishing here between, say, just actions taken in to rein in the actions of troublemakers, the activities of troublemakers, or the unjust punishment of some group for reasons that either do not apply or are not proportionate. Distinguishing those two things, there was never persecution of the Jews in the papal states. Certainly not. there were measures taken against them. They were required to do certain things, were not allowed to do certain other things, so on and so forth. You have to look at the whole history of that, which is beyond our scope right now. And so they were dealt with as necessary, just as any other group of troublesome people might be dealt with, but never mistreated. On Good Friday, in the midst of the solemn orations, the church prays for the conversion of the Jews very publicly. Traditionally, this is the pre-55 Holy Week, traditionally without the genuflection that usually accompanies the orations in that part of the ceremony. And the reason is that the Jews knelt down in mocking veneration for our Lord. So the church, in praying for the conversion of the Jews, does not carry out the action that they carried out in mockery of our Lord. That was added back in the 1955 Holy Week. And also, sometimes it's brought up as a complaint against the church that the church calls the Jews perfidious in the ceremony. The actual word used is perfidis Judaeis. And perfidious in English is much stronger than perfidis here. This means blind. Let's pray for the blind Jews. That's blind because they willingly shut their eyes to Christ. And that is the point, obviously, at which they went wrong. They've gone off the rails in various other ways, of course, since then, but that was the big break, so to speak. There's nothing in the Old Testament which they accept that is heretical, of course. But that is the unique error of the Jews to reject the Messiahs. I believe it was Bishop Sheen, who definitely had problems, but I believe it was Bishop Sheen who said that they're waiting on the platform for a train that came 2,000 years ago. Which is true. So, the church very publicly prays for their conversion, though without that genuflection, and just praying for them as blind. Does not call them, it's not saying, let's pray for those perfidious Jews. Let's pray for the Jews who have been blinded. Willfully blinded. So the popes had never forgotten that Jesus Christ had been born amongst the Jews. On September 1st, 1938, the Italian government issued yet more anti-Jewish laws, and in this document, Jews were defined as those born of parents of a Jewish race, even if they might profess a religion different from Judaism. So the Italian Jews were very much afraid of persecution. And notice they're afraid of persecution from the Italian government, not from the church. Of course, this is time long after, many decades after, in fact, nearly 40 years, nearly 70 years after the seizure of Rome by the Sardinians in 1870. So nearly 70 years after that, the Jews in areas in which they were never persecuted, of course, by the popes, even not in any capacity, either as head of the church, visible head of the church on earth, or as the temporal ruler of the papal states. In areas in which they were never persecuted, they are afraid of persecution by the leftist Italian government, by the fascist government. Consequently, 1 in 10 of Italian Jews over the next 3 years would renounce his religion and seek baptism. So problems such as this arise. Of course, that brings up a question when they're afraid of falling under laws such as this, or being subject to other penalties. They start embracing baptism. They start receiving baptism and becoming Catholics. Externally, at least, the question arises: how many of those conversions are then sincere? Problems like this have arisen in the history of the church. It was actually because of that, of just such a problem in Spain, that the Spanish Inquisition was instituted. And remember, that was a civil institution, not an ecclesiastical one. It was in a situation in which church and state were united, as they ought to be, and therefore cooperated in it. But they'll still, even when correctly united, church and state are two separate entities. The state is not the church, and the church is not the state. They are two separate entities still, even when correctly united and cooperating. Still, therefore, it has to be classified as either one or the other, an ecclesiastical or civil institution. It was a civil institution. But one of the big impetus for it was this problem of many Jews in Spain receiving baptism and becoming Catholics, at least externally, but the suspicion was insincerely, that they were still secretly practicing Judaism. And the idea, and remember, the Spanish Inquisition was aimed at those people, not the Jews themselves. They never went after the Jews. The idea was that we have to make sure that everybody who is a Catholic actually says he's a Catholic, that there are no secret Jews among Catholics. So when have these problems arise as a result of cases in which there's a high suspicion of insincere conversions taking place in large numbers. So Pius XI had been for a long time very disturbed about the anti-Jewish laws in Italy, not because they limited Jewish influence in Italy, but because of the racial aspect. Since the Catholic Church is open to all peoples of all races and could not approve of any kind of racial denigration of the Jews. Pius XI had given an audience in July of 1938 to the staff of Belgian Catholic Radio, in which he said, every time I read the words, the sacrifice of our father Abraham in the canon of the Mass, I cannot help but be deeply moved. It is impossible for Christians to participate in anti-Semitism. Again, he's of course using that in the sense that we mean it here, that is on the basis of race. It's a term that's come to be applied to anybody who opposes any Jew on any issue whatsoever. And it is only correctly applied to those who oppose the Jews on the basis of race. So that's what he's talking about here. It is impossible for Christians, meaning for this term, which objectively is synonymous with Catholic. It is immoral for anybody, but what he's saying here is that no Catholic, no good Catholic who is consistent with the teachings of the Church could ever possibly participate in any opposition to the Jews purely on the basis of race. That is not in other words, that is not the problem that the Church has with them. No Catholic could ever insist that it is. We recognize that everyone has the right to self-defense and can take those necessary actions to safeguard his legitimate interests, but anti-Semitism is inadmissible. Spiritually, we are all Semites. We talked about the way in which that is understood, that you have our Lord himself born amongst the Jews, Our Lady, the apostles, St. Paul, obviously, he even talks about that. He mentioned that in one of his epistles that I was, he says in equivalent words, but I was the most Jewish of all of them. In other words, he was the most ardently persecuted the church. He said that. So he was the most ardent in doing that. And ended up becoming the apostles, St. Paul. So apostolic was he that now when you use the term the apostle without any further qualification, it means St. Paul. And he himself explains in one of his epistles why that is the case. He explains that now he labored under the accusation, St. Paul did, of not being a real apostle because he was not one of the 12. He was not chosen, obviously, to replace Judas Iscariot. So there was an accusation against him that you're not a real apostle. But in one of his epistles, he answers that accusation and says that, well, given everything I've suffered for the faith, which is quite an extensive list, and it was not even the full list, there were other things he suffered subsequent to that. He explains that I'm more of an apostle than the others in that way. Again, St. Paul, formerly very ardently in favor of Judaism as a religion, rather than the race. Obviously, we're talking about here. Very much a Jew in that sense. Before his very dramatic and truly miraculous conversion. The Osservatore Romano published an account of this speech to the Belgian Catholic Radio, but did not print what he said concerning the Jews. It was probably due to the intervention of Pacelli. Again, something that his grandfather, who founded the Osservatore Romano, would probably not have done. Although this is only speculation, what is true, that is the thing that's speculation, is that Pacelli intervened to prevent the publication of those particular statements, those remarks. That's only speculation. What is true is that most of the pages from Pacelli's notes of the meetings of the Pope in these months are missing from those that are open to researchers in the Vatican secret archives. So it was buried for one reason or another. And the sections of Pacelli's notes in particular are missing. So September 29th, 1938, Mussolini goes to Munich in order to preside over the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. So this was just one instance of the fact that the Second World War was very much a product of the First. Czechoslovakia was a nation that came into being after the dissolution of the Austrian Empire, and contained within it, again, the one of the famous principles of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was that of self-determination of peoples living in these empires that he saw as being prisons of nations. These nations should be allowed to go free from these empires of which they are part. And he was very surprised to find out that there are millions of Germans living within the boundaries of this new nation of Czechoslovakia in the region known as the Sudetenland. But those Germans were not allowed to become part of Germany. No self-determination for them. Also, at the end of the war, First World War, Austria wanted to become part of Germany. They lost their whole empire. They were very greatly reduced in size. Remember that it's interesting to note that Austria had its own separate empire, separate from the German Empire. Remember, Prussia had emerged as the number one German state, so to speak, and had the ones that were left anyway after Napoleon was done with rampaging around. They had in the mid-19th century forged all of those remaining German nations into one empire. Those other kingdoms were still there. There was still a kingdom of Bavaria, still a kingdom of Saxony, for example. But Austria was still separate. And that was dating back to a time when, you're hearing about it now in the reading, the Holy Roman Empire was theoretically, yes, an empire, successor to the Western Roman Empire, but was in effect a loosely organized Germany. And the emperor had relatively little power, direct power things. He was definitely in an influential position, and theoretically he was the ruler. But in effect, in practice, the lower-ranking nobles were the ones who actually had the final say in a great many things in their own regions. They couldn't be. The emperor could only do so much to impose his will. So the fact that Austria was separate, Austria was just another German state that happened to build up its own empire. Does anybody know that there's a famous Latin statement associated with how Austria built its empire? Yes.
Through marriage?
Yes. Yeah. There's a famous Latin statement: "Alii bella gerant, tu Austria felix nubes." So let others wage wars. That is, to build up empires, other nations wage wars of conquest, but you, happy Austria, you marry. In other words, that was how that happened. You can see on the map over there. It's behind the door right now. But Austria built up that empire mainly just by marrying into other royal families of other ruling nations, or getting those royal families to marry into the Habsburgs, and just inherited all those lands. That was how Austria built its empire. And it is being on the losing side of a tremendous war doesn't help, but the Austrian Empire is often looked upon as being more or less the way that Woodrow Wilson looked upon it, which was as a prison of nations. But actually, people who visited it prior to the war were actually impressed with the abilities of the Habsburg monarchy to hold it all together. And generally speaking, so places like that have so many different, an empire like that has so many different nationalities, so many different ethnicities within it. Many times it turns out after the fact, once that empire has been dissolved, that they were better off as an empire in many different ways. For one thing, they might all hate each other, might all hate one another, but they hate the monarchy even more. And so they get along amongst themselves because they have all their hatred is focused on something else. That's just one way. So all that because we're talking about Mussolini going to Munich in order to preside over the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. This was late 1930s. Hitler is agitating a very great deal, rearming Germany in just utter defiance of the Versailles Treaty. And the idea at the time was, well, maybe we can just appease him. Maybe we can prevent another war. Everybody could see another war coming. And there was this desperate attempt to prevent it. And one of those things was to give Hitler what he wanted at this Munich conference in 1938. And there's probably the most famous single statement connected with this. Does anybody know who delivered it, when, and where, and what he said? Has to do with the British Prime Minister at the time. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. After he was there too, all these heads of government even went to Munich to negotiate with Hitler, and they ended up giving him the Sudetenland, as it was called, those areas of Czechoslovakia holding millions of Germans. They finally gave that to him. Again, remember, Hitler was very much an irredentist, as it's called. In other words, he had the idea that where there's a German, there is Germany. Much as we talked about before with Serbia, the Serbs had this idea, where there is a Serb, there is Serbia. Hitler had effectively, whether he ever formulated it that way, I don't know whether he uttered those exact words, but that's definitely what he thought. That where there is a German, there is the Reich. So that was why he thought himself entitled to take over Austria, for one thing, which actually Austria rather welcomed. Even ecclesiastics, even higher ranking, we saw that last year, higher ranking ecclesiastics within Austria welcomed that. And then also Germans in the Sudetenland, he wanted to get all of that. So he was all on that title, that where there is a German, there is the Reich. So the idea was, okay, maybe if we give him that, he'll be happy and stop causing trouble. It didn't work. And this is where our anecdote comes in. After arriving back in London, getting off his plane, Neville Chamberlain very famously held up the paper that had been signed in Munich and said, peace in our time. In other words, we've done it. Hitler's been appeased. He's happy now. Yes, we've had to give up a good portion of Czechoslovakia to him, but he'll stop causing trouble, and there will not be a war. Everybody calm down. Don't stop worrying about a war. It's all okay. And then when the war broke out, he had to resign almost immediately as British Prime Minister. That statement is easily the most famous statement that did not age well, to say the least. So he said that thing almost exactly a year before the war broke out. September 1st, 1939, that Hitler invaded Poland, and that's the usual date from given for the start of the First World War. So almost exactly a year before, he said, peace in our time. So Mussolini was there for that. When he returned to Italy, he was very much perturbed by the opposition to his racial laws. The Grand Council approved, the Grand Council of Italy approved of new racial laws at this time. So they're ramping it up. The Holy See made no objection, provided that the new laws did not treat Catholics who had converted from Judaism as if they were Jews. Again, remember, the Church herself does not allow, at least not without a dispensation, marriages between Catholics and Jews. So the Duce remained firm. He remained stubborn, and said that he would never grant any exceptions for mixed marriages. Again, according to his definition. What he's defining as a mixed marriage is not what the Church defines as a mixed marriage. Mixed marriage, as far as the Church is concerned, as we said, is a marriage between a baptized Catholic and a baptized heretic. That's a mixed marriage. It has nothing to do with race or anything else. It has to do purely with that person's membership in the Church. Baptized heretic is not a member of the Church. A baptized Catholic is. That baptized Catholic, and because of the character of baptism, which was imprinted, or legally, is considered to have been imprinted on his soul, he is subject to the laws of the Church, but is still not a member of the Church. It's a heretic who is a member of a heretical sect. Somebody who not only holds heresy, but is a member of a heretical sect. So the Duce, though, is referring to mixed marriages. Anybody, that includes, at least, as far as he's concerned, marriage between a Catholic and someone born a Jew, but who has embraced the faith and received baptism. So Pius XI, for his part, remained intransigent on the issue, as well he ought. He decided to write a letter both to Mussolini and to the king, personally requesting of each of them to permit marriages between two Catholics regardless of their race. And this is indeed exactly how the Church looks at membership in the Church. That in a sense that supersedes all the rest. Not to say that the differences based on nationalities or ethnicities, that those are illegitimate or ought to be ignored or anything like that. But that ultimately a member of the Catholic Church is a member of the Catholic Church. His background does not matter. Certainly not with regard to marriage impediments. That is not something that the Church legislates concerning. So Cardinal Pacelli informed the government that the law clearly violated the Concordat. The Vatican issued an official letter of protest to the Italian government, which the Pope ordered Cardinal Pacelli to prepare and send to the Italian ambassador. So again, you know that the Italian government is really misbehaving itself when Cardinal Pacelli is the one complaining. If there's a possibility to be conciliatory, he will pursue it. And he's not pursuing it here. Therefore, they've reached the end of the line, at least on this issue, as far as negotiation and diplomacy are concerned. So the Vatican issued an official, so that the letter said that the new marriage law conflicted with Article 34 of the Concordat. It said that the Church welcomes any people of any race. That is, the letter said that the Church welcomes people of any race. Absolutely. He said that races, ultimately, of course, there's only one big human race. We're talking here about true accidental, but still true differences among different groups of people. It's true that different nations vary very greatly in culture, not only in physical appearance, perhaps, but also in culture. Say, if you go to Japan, for example, that's almost like going to another planet. The culture is just so different. Nothing at all like it is here. Now, they've been westernized to a degree, but it's still very different. So he said that when two Catholics of different races insisted on being married, the Church could not deny them the sacrament. So the Church will refuse, for example, in the case of some people who want a mixed marriage, if they do not guarantee to raise the children Catholic, the Church will say, not happening. That is not happening. Or if there's a very great danger in the case of a request for dispensation from the impediment of disparity of cult, which already requires a pretty strong reason anyway, if there's not a founded hope that, if it's not guaranteed that the Catholic party will remain within the Church, that the children will be raised Catholic, and that that there's a hope, at least, that the non-Catholic party will convert, then, or at the very least, will not cause any trouble, then the Church will say no dispensation. The Church can forbid certain marriages, rendering them thereby invalid. And even with regard to mixed marriages, the displeasure of the Church that such a thing is happening is clear from the way that the ceremony is carried out. Authors say it should take place in the sacristy, so not even in the church, just in the sacristy, and the priest, he doesn't wear any vestments at all. Just stands there in cassock, just as I'm standing here right now, or sitting in class in cassock. Also, the priest, he would just go to the sacristy in cassock. Okay, mixed marriage got to take place here, to give it some exhortation that says, you've promised certain things here, make sure you live up to those promises. All right, now go through the two parties exchange vows, the marriage is contracted, and the priest records it afterwards, and that's it. There's no ceremonies involved. There's no mess connected with it. The Church will. It's clear that this is a toleration. And toleration means comes from the Latin word to suffer something. We're suffering this in order to bring about some greater good or avoid some greater evil, because this is an evil in itself. So, Cardinal Pacelli ended the document, this letter, by saying that he hoped that the government would reconsider and make these changes which the Vatican was requesting. The Osservatore Romano published the Pacelli letter to the government, but when Pius XI read it, he was absolutely furious because he had instructed that his letter to Mussolini and to the king also be published. So not only to Mussolini, but also to the king. He wanted to publish the king's reply to him, because the king had told Mussolini to alter the marriage law and to accommodate the Pope's concern. The Pope wanted everyone to know that Mussolini had ignored the king. Mussolini is definitely the strong man in the Italian regime. He's the one who's running the country. But this is still a monarchy that he's working for. In theory, he's just the minister of the king. And in the U.S., it's an unusual thing, really, in the world at large, to have the head of state and the head of government be the same person. In most other countries, those are two separate positions. You have a ruler and someone who takes care of the administration of the government. King, or even in the case of France, for example, president, but also a prime minister. So in France, they do have a president, but also a prime minister who's just appointed by the president. He could be fired by the president. So that's the theory in a great many places. Head of state, who takes care of, definitely has his own duties. He ultimately has the final say as the ruler of the nation. But the prime minister, in different places, in practice it varies, but in theory, is just exactly that, the first minister of the government. An administrator who takes care of the day-to-day details of running the country, which might perhaps either be too much for the monarch or the president to take care of himself, or it might just be beneath his dignity. We're not going to have, say, a king or an emperor meeting with foreign ambassadors every day. You have the prime minister or perhaps the foreign minister, what we call in this country the secretary of state, deal with all of that stuff. But you're not going to have someone who's the head of state dealing with all the little details of managing a nation. Sometimes heads of state opt to do that. For example, Philip II of Spain, we just heard about him in the reading, son of Emperor Charles V. Philip II, was never Holy Roman Emperor, but he was King of Spain, ruler of a huge portion of the surface of the globe, and he was famous for micromanaging things. He'd spend a lot of time taking care of a lot of little details of a lot of different things. He was famous for that. Sometimes those rulers choose to do that, but more often they have. That's why prime ministers exist, because that's an enormous job ruling a nation, especially at that time, and ruling the percentage of the surface of the earth that the Habsburgs ruled at the time. That was a huge job. So that can be an enormous task, and many times sovereigns or presidents employ, in the case of a constitutional government, a constitutional monarchy, or an elected republic, that might even be required by the constitution of the nation. But even when it's not, you still many times have somebody who's there to help take care of the government. It makes sense that should be the case. So theoretically here, Mussolini is the minister of the king, who is bound to obey the king. You're supposed to meet with the king, take orders from him, get instructions as to what to do, and then act in accordance with that. And if the king says accommodate the Pope's requests, then Mussolini, as the minister, a servant of the king, ultimately, must do that. And so Pius XI here, he sees that this request was denied. I want, therefore, to make it clear by means of publishing the letter that I sent to the king and the letter that the king sent back, to make it clear that Mussolini is a bad minister. I mean, he was bad in many ways, obviously, but we're talking about here not in the sense of ineffective, but disobedient to the king whom he's supposedly serving. So Tardini told Pius XI that he, Pius, did order that the text of the letter should be published, but that the Holy Father must have forgotten that Cardinal Pacelli had convinced him, Pius XI, not to do so. The reason? It was against diplomatic rules to publish such correspondence, but Pacelli also said that it would have made Mussolini look very bad if he were seen by everyone as a disobedient minister. Meanwhile, that was the original idea. We're going to show that this Mussolini is a disgusting character. In many ways, you've seen some of the ways in which he was a disgusting character, being a publicly professed atheist, having 100 mistresses, or even more than that. He was a disgusting human being from many aspects, and this is just one more. We want to make that clear. But again, Pacelli, that's against protocol. You just don't do that. That's not diplomatic. Oh, sure, it's not diplomatic, but the idea here was not to be diplomatic. So when Pacelli said this, Pius XI said, "Sovereign courtesy opposed to supreme villainy." In other words, we have been very, very, okay, maybe I agreed to that, but that is extremely generous and very, very courteous to this supreme villain that is this disgusting man, Benito Mussolini. Pius XI, however, insisted that the king's reply be placed in the Osservatore Romano the next day. So he does require that. Neither Pacelli nor Tardini wanted this to happen. So they both, when they hear that, they both react badly. They don't want it to happen. Cardinal Pacelli managed to convince him, Pius XI, otherwise. So finally, it didn't happen. The government did not respond to Cardinal Pacelli's letter protesting the marriage law. So there would have been, almost guaranteed there would have been some reaction had those other letters been published. But Cardinal Pacelli's diplomatic course, just ignore that. By the end of 1938, Pius XI was close to death. On Christmas Eve, the cardinals were in the Vatican to receive the annual blessing from the Pope. He was going to give a speech to them, but he had not sent it in advance to Pacelli. He said that on February 11th, there would be a celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Concordat. But it's incidental to this, but does anybody know what feast is on February 11th? Yes. No. Yes.
The apparition of Our Lady of Lourdes.
Yes. The apparition of the Immaculate Conception, February 11th. So that's known, and I don't see any necessary connection here between those two things, but that is in fact the case. Right, so on that day, there would be a celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Concordat. He praised Mussolini, for certain things anyway, but also lamented the recent apotheosis in Rome prepared for a cross that is the enemy of the cross of Christ, by which he means the swastika. He said that the swastika was a symbol of the wound inflicted on the Concordat and of the persecution of the members of Catholic Action. Although I suppose it should be noted that the swastika was not always the symbol of evil that it's been for a long time now, since certainly the reign of Pius XI, since 1938 at the very latest. But it used to just be a pattern. You can find it a repeating pattern even in at least one cathedral. You can find that. It's just a pattern. The Nazis adopted it as their symbol, so now it's a symbol of everything that they did and said and held. And all of that is evil. But it's an example of actually what's called, if you've seen, maybe you've seen that in logic, but it's an example of what we call an arbitrary sign. That is to say, it's not something that has an intrinsic connection to that for which it stands. Say that as smoke is a sign of fire. That's called an instrumental sign. It's a necessary connection. Where there is smoke, there must also be fire. But it's an example of an arbitrary sign. That is to say, by agreement of men, this thing stands for this thing. So, for example, why the color red stands for revolution. That came to be. You can look at the history of how that came to be, but ultimately, there's no intrinsic connection between red and revolution. Otherwise, the church would not use the red vestments during Mass. There's no intrinsic connection. Red can stand for different things. So in politics, except for in this country, which is interesting, but that's a whole other story, red is generally a symbol of revolution. Generally. So the swastika is not, it's just a pattern in itself, but it's become an arbitrary sign, and by along the lines of an arbitrary sign under that heading, a symbol of things that are very evil. And that's a very strong connection. A connection between an arbitrary sign and that for which it stands can be stronger or weaker. And the connection between this arbitrary sign and that for which it stands is very, very strong indeed. So it is truly, therefore, a symbol of evil. It is truly a cross that is the enemy of the cross of Christ. That is a symbol of the wound inflicted on the Concordat, a persecution of the members of Catholic Action. So this is a speech that Pacelli has not seen the draft of. Probably those remarks would not have gotten through had he been permitted any kind of editing power over this speech. So right now, you can see on this very page here, we're getting right to the end of, we'll say, Pius XII's pre-reign career, we can call it. Everything he's done before that, that's what we've been focusing on. Areas we've touched, mostly last year, but areas we've touched before. We've been really just looking at all of that again from a different angle. And now, very soon, here we're going to begin the actual reign of Pope Pius XII from 1939 to 1958.